Hi, everyone. So I decided I would record my talk on the concepts of love and desire in Islamic Sufism and make that accessible for you instead of going live. I'm going to focus on Attar in this talk because my first book was on Attar. Um, and that is where I have much expertise. So it's called Subjectivity in Attar, Persian Sufism, and European Mysticism. And I will start with this line from Wadi Ishq from Attar's Mantiqatir, the Valley of Love. بعد از این وادی عشق آید پدید غرق آتش شد کسی کانجا رسید. Love's Valley is the next, and here desire will plunge the pilgrim into seas of fire. So, the religious conscience of Muslim mystics centers upon the primordial covenant between God and future humanity, referred to in the Quran, where God asks the question of Adam's offspring. I'm quoting, "Am I not your Lord?" And they answered, "Of course, we testify." In the Quran, the spirit is identified by three primordial moments, which Michael Sells calls them the moment of creation, the moment of prophecy, and the moment of truth or the day of judgment, in which the spirit returns to the celestial analog of Kaaba. So this is from Michael Sells' book, Early Islamic Mysticism. The first primordial moment is when Adam was created and God blew his soul into him. And this is called the day of Alast or Ruze Alast, returning to which is the goal of all Muslim mystics. This is the day when Anne-Marie Schimmel writes, only God existed before he led future creatures out of the abyss of not being and endowed them with life, love, and understanding so that they might face God again at the end of time. This moment when all dualities merge and unite with the divine is the only meaningful concept left. The self or the nafs and the divine other, the created and the creator, meet each other and become one. The eternal and the temporal lose their meaning. All boundaries between the physical and the spiritual are blurred. It is a transcendental moment. Now, the origins of the Sufism, Islamic Sufism, should also be traced back to the life and sayings of Prophet Muhammad and to the socio-political conditions of the time period in which he lived. Prophet Muhammad's asceticism, piety, night vigils, and prayers were among the first models of conduct followed by the early Sufis, who focused mainly on asceticism more than on anything else in their religious practices. Now, it should also be noted that in many parts of the Near and Middle East, Islam grew mainly within a Christian environment. The Muslims of the period maintained close social and intellectual contacts with their Christian neighbors and were directly influenced by the teachings of Christian mystics or had previously been Christians themselves. Although Sufism emerged under the Umayyad dynasty, Islamic mysticism or Sufism only began to flourish during the Abbasid Empire when the capital was moved from Damascus to Baghdad and the majority of the non-Arabian population of the Middle East had converted to Islam already. Over the centuries, one area in which there has always been mutual interaction and influence between Christians and Muslims was mysticism. And in the formative years of Islamic thought, Early Sufis and Muslim mystics were influenced by the ideas and practices of Christian monks. Similar to Christian monastic life that emerged as a protest against the worldliness of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, Sufism also evolved as a protest against the worldliness of the officials and caliphs after the Muslim conquest. Of course, after having fully developed, Sufism also influenced some of the Western Christian mystics as well, especially in Spain from the 12th to 14th century. There are parallels between the sayings of Muslim Sufis and Christian mystics. For example, the statement authored by the Sufi Mansur al-Hallaj, I am the truth or an al-Haq, has a similar underlying meaning to the sayings by Christian mystics such as those of the English Julian of Norwich, who said that I saw no difference between God and our substance. Now, the transformative power of love has long been at the center of Islamic Sufism. In Sufism, love leads to reconstruction of the self, initiating rediscovery of and union with the divine beloved. Sufi writers spoke of two different kinds of love, that of God and that of things that God loves. For Sufi thinkers, for example, such as Ahmad al-Ghazali, Ain al-Ghuzat al-Hamedani, Farid Attar Neishaburi, and Jalaluddin Rumi, profane love, perceived as the love of the worldly beloved, was the first step on the path toward union with the divine. They believe that earthly love is the emanation of sacred love. In their eyes, the love of every created object elevates the individual spiritually, so they move even nearer to the love of God and beatific vision. Nevertheless, the relationship between the sacred and profane, earthly and heavenly love in Islamic discourse has always been a controversial one, often pitting orthodox religious theologians against liberal spiritual Sufis. Plato was the first author to assert that the experience of beholding a beautiful human being, called Iphib, can instigate a vision of the absolute beauty of the divine. And of course, Neoplatonists followed Plato in this thinking. Through this fusion of the heavenly and the earthly, humans experience the sacred in the form of the profane. So they are confronted by a mysterious act through which ordinary profane objects become sacred. That is to say, their nature changes, yet these objects continue to be what they are and keep their due place in the cosmic order. Now, a similar discourse bearing similar features that is focusing on earthly love as a doorway to spiritual love evolved in Persian Sufi literature during the medieval period. The term ishq, which is usually translated as profane love or passionate love, and its derivatives were frequently used in classical Persian prose and poetry. Beginning in the in the middle of 8th century and during the 9th century, some of the more determined Sufis used the term to express the relationship between the creator and his creatures. However, before the 10th century, discussions of love and longing were mainly semantic in nature. The Orthodox theologians had objected to the use of the word muhabbat or love, but the word ishq was introduced to describe the relationship between the divine and his creations. And when the ishq was introduced, even Sufi thinkers objected to its use because it referred to the passionate, overflowing kind of love and longing that they believed would not have been a quality for a self-sufficient divine being. So not only muhabbat was not appropriate, the Sufis also did not agree in using the word ishq for a representation of love of God or a self-sufficient divine being. Nonetheless, Sufis proceeded to contemplate divine beauty and love as manifested in human form. And this human form was called shahid, which meant an eyewitness or a testimony. So the beauty of earthly human forms created by God was perceived as a testimony to the beauty and presence of the divine. Hence, the earthly was regarded as a key to the heavenly. And Attar was one of the most significant authors to espouse and articulate the term Ishq as a representation of both earthly and heavenly love. Attar wrote 8 books of poetry, which contain 45,000 verses, and his books include Elahiname, Pandname, Khosroname, Divan, Mukhtarname, Musibatname, Mantaqa, and his prose work, Tazkiratul Awliya. In each of these works, Attar creates and establishes correspondences between the divine and the human realm through his love narratives and analogies, foregrounding unconventional lovers, transgressors, and marginalized members of society as true lovers of the divine. Attar demonstrates in his works how deviating from the moral codes and crossing the boundaries, conventional boundaries, and the status quo allows the violators to annihilate the ego, that is their nafs, and reconstruct their identities and rediscover the divine through earthly love. So this is my own argument. That is what I argued in my book. Now, how did this thread of spirituality come to run through Attar's works and writings? There are several anecdotes and accounts of how Attar became attracted to Sufism, and one of them is found in Maulana Abdurrahman Jami's Nafahatul Ons, where he relates that one day Attar was busy in his shop when a dervish entered, begging Attar to give him something in the name of God. And Attar, as his name indicates, was a kind of herbalist slash pharmacist at the time. So Attar ignored this dervish's request, and the dervish asked him, "Sir, how will you pass away?" Attar replied, "Just as you will." The dervish put his wooden bowl under his head, lay down, invoked God, and passed away. Baffled by this incident, Attar left his profession to become a devotee of Sufism. Now, Daulat Shah Samarkandi also relates that Attar turned to Sufism after his encounter with a dervish who admonished Attar for his infatuation with worldly matters and riches. However, Badiüzzaman Furuzanfar argues that Attar was attracted to Sufism since his childhood. It is also believed that Attar joined a Sufi settlement under the guidance of Rukneddin, a sheikh of Kobrawiye order, after which he traveled to Mecca on pilgrimage. And it can be assumed that he started writing after his pilgrimage, because he went through this phase of spiritual development. Many individuals have also been mentioned as Attar's masters, but considering the time period when he lived, the only plausible one seems to be Najmuddin Kubra. Abdul Hussein Zarrinkub writes that although there was great respect between the two and Najmuddin's master Majduddin of Baghdad, Attar himself was considered to be a complete and perfect sheikh who did not need a master. Now, on the other hand, Jami considers Attar to be an Owaisi Sufi, after Owais al-Gharani, having al-Hallaj in mind, since it is believed that in Owaisi's school of Sufism, spiritual knowledge could have been transmitted between two individuals without their physical contact or physically having met or interacted. However, it is not even certain whether Attar belonged to any particular Sufi group, let alone any Sufi order or silsile, or in his works, he never identifies any master or any Sufi order that he belonged to. So there is much uncertainty about Attar's participation in Sufi orders and settlements, but though he might not have had a master, there is no doubt that he was inspired by Al-Hallaj's love mysticism. Attar derived his philosophy or spirituality and interest in love Sufism from several centuries of earlier Sufi writings on love. In the initial years of Islam, Sufism mainly focused on asceticism, as I mentioned. However, it was in the 8th century when it evolved from its original ascetic form into a doctrine of selfless love for the divine. In such a state of selflessness, Margaret Smith writes that the Sufi, and I'm quoting here, ceases to exist and passes out of self. She or he is one with God and altogether God or the divine. Sufis also base their understanding of love on the Quranic verse that refer to the precedence of man's love for God above anything else. Generations of Sufis gave love and intuitive knowledge of the divine preeminence over discursive learning and knowledge of the divine. Sufis strove to return to the origin from which everything proceeded. They wanted to reach to this state in which they were before they existed. That is the state of that primordial covenant when the divine was alone and nothing yet existed. And this is the moment which I talked about at the beginning of this talk. In that moment, God breathed into man and created Adam in his own image, so that man became the perfect image of the divine, like a mirror reflecting his qualities. It is only through the return to this perfect image of the divine that Sufis believe they can reach union with the divine. They believe that God created man as his highest manifestation because he wanted to be known. And there is this surah, and I'm quoting it, I was a hidden treasure and I wanted to be known. So I created the world. Sufis believe that the divine is closer than the jugular vein. So they needed to look into their own hearts to find the divine. Regarding the significance of love in Sufism, Anne-Marie Schimmel writes this: mysticism can be defined as love of the absolute. For the power that separates true mysticism from asceticism is love. Divine love makes the seeker capable of bearing, even of enjoying all the pain and afflictions that God showers upon him in order to test him and to purify his soul. This love can carry the mystic's heart to the divine presence, like the falcon, which carries away the prey, separating him thus from all that is created in time. In their writings, many Sufis distinguish between asceticism and mysticism. For example, Jami explains this as follows, and I'm quoting this, and this is from Nafahatul Ons. The ascetics regard the beauty of the other world with the light of faith and certitude and despite the world, but are still veiled by a sensual pleasure, namely the thought of paradise. Whereas the true Sufi is veiled from both worlds by the vision of the primordial beauty and essential love. At the beginning of the Abbasid period, Sufis and ascetics who admonished the rulers for their wrongdoings and criticized them boldly were tolerated. However, gradually, the rulers began to treat them with less forbearance. One such example was, of course, the execution of Al-Hallaj who had recklessly expressed the statement, "An al-Haq, I am the truth," on his way to execution. When asked what made him so excited in the face of approaching death, he replied that death was his way to heaven and to union with the Absolute. Al-Hallaj's belief was that the relationship between the Creator and his creations was reciprocal, and that God had created man in his own image. He held that God had shaped man like a mirror so that he would be able to see his love in him, and that this love was the secret of creation. Many later Sufis were, of course, inspired by Al-Hallaj's spirituality and referenced him in their works, and one such reference can be found in Attar's Tazkiratul Awliya, where Attar relates that while Al-Hallaj was waiting in prison to be executed, a dervish asked him, quote, "What is love?" And he replied, "You will see it today and tomorrow and the day after," end quote. Al-Hallaj was then executed on the same day, burnt the next day, and had his ashes given to the wind on the third. Attar writes, "This is love." This peculiar type of Al-Hallajian love mysticism was subsequently embodied in Attar's writings. And through this story, Attar tells about the life and spirituality of a Sufi who became what Anne-Marie Chimal says, a symbol for both suffering love and unitive experience, but also for a lover's greatest sin, to divulge the secret of his love. Al-Hallaj's execution, in Majid Fakhri's words, was, quote, "a stark reminder of the dangers inherent in the doctrine of the essence of union, which Al-Hallaj interpreted as simply the manner in which the mystic becomes an instrument of God, speaking and writing on his behalf," end quote. Al-Hallaj was executed for the boldness of his mystical interpretation, which was deemed to be blasphemous self-deification. Through this boldness, he had transformed Sufism and brought it out of the khanaqah, or the convents, into the public to be disseminated among the lay people. This transmission of Sufism into the public, which was in fact a form of social protest, obviously threatened the rulers. Unlike Al-Hallaj, many ascetics and Sufis of the time chose to ignore the wrongdoings of the rulers and resorted to seclusion in convents. Gradually, social criticism gave way to a form of seclusion and asceticism whose goal was not mastery over one's soul or over one's nafs, but over other humans. The outcome was the emergence of a different group of Sufis who departed considerably from the earlier principles of Sufism. In such conditions, the true Sufis who stayed faithful to those principles were stranded between two different groups: the earthly rulers on one side and their followers, the pretentious Sufis and ascetics, on the other. The true Sufis had no other choice but to either stay silent and ignore the corruption of the society, or to be loyal to their principles and accept death as a result. And Al-Hallaj chose loyalty and death. Therefore, he became the epitome of suffering on the path of divine love and submission to the union of the divine beloved. He believed that the essence of God and the creation was love, and that ishq, or worldly love, was the doorway to profane love, to divine love, or sacred love. Many Sufis, such as Ahmad al-Ghazali, al-Hamedani, Ibn al-Arabi, and of course Attar, followed al-Hallaj. Regarding love in Sufism, this is what I believe Attar believed that love was not limited to humans. He saw love in all creations as emanations of divine love. He loved the entire world and all creatures in it. For him, God's motivation for creating the world and the people in it was love. For Attar, all the elements of the universe, from the lowliest to the noblest, were in constant motion towards one destination, and that was the divine. And the reason for this attraction is nothing but love. The entire universe is in love with God and seeks its origin in Him. Attar's works portray the constant seeking of the progression of the seeker's soul towards its goal and origin. Attar exposes the endless longing of the human soul to go through the different stages of development and annihilation of the nafs, or the lower self, before becoming perfect to be in union with the divine. However, as it was with Al-Hallaj and his mysticism, walking on the path towards the divine is fraught with pain and suffering. For Attar, Sufism begins with pain and reaches perfection through pain. Regarding the theme of pain and suffering in Attar's spirituality, Al-Hallaj's spirituality was the inspiration for his initiation on the divine path. It is from Al-Hallaj that Attar learned to endure suffering and pain on the path of divine love. Attar is characterized as the voice of pain, the voice of longing, and of searching in Persian mystical tradition. Attar believed that even in the physical world, love is the main element on the path leading to union with the divine. And according to Attar, a true Salek, a wayfarer, a beginner Sufi, should seek earthly love on the divine path and relinquish the lower self or the nafs through love in order to find God and reach divine union. After Attar, Sufi poetry reached its peak with Rumi. According to Jami and later Dolat Shah, Rumi met Attar in Neshabur on his way from Balkh to central Iran with his father. During this visit, Attar gave his book Asrarname to Rumi. This is what is believed to have happened. Although this story has not been recounted in any of Rumi's own biographies, it may be believed to be accurate because Attar was still alive when Rumi's father passed through Khorasan. At the time, it was very customary for the Sufis to visit their followers, their fellow Sufis, wherever they traveled. Therefore, it is possible that Rumi and his father visited Attar on their way. And this is documented in Dolat Shah's book. Furzan Far also indicates that since the spiritual connection between Attar and Rumi is evident in Rumi's Masnavi, and many stories from Attar's works can be found also in Rumi's works, it is possible that Rumi had read Attar's works and was inspired by him. His famous verse praising Sanai Ghaznavi and Attar is memorable. This is what Rumi wrote. Sanai was the spirit and Attar his two eyes. We have come after Sanai and Attar. This line, of course, cannot be found in Rumi's own works. However, it is believed that it was coined by his son, Sultan Balad, and repeated in several of his ghazals. Nonetheless, the fact that more than 35 of Rumi's stories in the Masnavi are derived from or inspired by Attar's works attests to Attar's great influence on Rumi and on Persian Sufi tradition and literature of the following generations.